Hello and welcome to another Ourdadsstamps video. For today's video I thought I'd talk about the stamps of Gibraltar. For those of you that don't know, Gibraltar is a small piece of land on the southern tip of Spain, and it has been part of the British Overseas Territory for more than 300 years. But if you've ever visited Gibraltar, one of the main ways of getting into Gibraltar, unless you fly, is actually on foot, because you can drive through Spain, but parking in Gibraltar is quite difficult. So many people park in Spain and then walk across the border. But the only way to get into Gibraltar, you have to actually walk across the main runway, which is quite interesting and a very strange experience. Gibraltar is definitely worth a visit, even if it's only for the experience of walking across a main runway. Anyway, back to the stamps. Gibraltar stamps are quite interesting, especially the early history of them. In actual fact, from 1850, when Spanish stamps were first introduced, you could use Spanish stamps in Gibraltar, even though it was a British territory. And this continued up until about 1857, when stamps of Great Britain were issued for use in Gibraltar, and they were franked with an A26 postmark. But during the interim period, it is possible to find covers with some Spanish stamps and some English stamps on them, which were accepted through the mail. Naturally enough, these command a high value, and I haven't actually seen one, but they do apparently exist. The initial supply of British stamps was only the penny, the fourpence and the sixpence, but gradually more and more values were introduced, and like many Commonwealth countries, it's possible to find lots of Victorian stamps with the local postmark on it. And as I said, for Gibraltar it's A26, so they're worth looking out for, and generally more valuable than if they'd been franked in England. In 1886, a curious thing occurred where Gibraltar actually used the stamps of Bermuda with Gibraltar overprinted on them. Now, I'm not quite sure why Bermuda stamps were chosen to overprint with Gibraltar, why it wasn't the British stamps or some other country, but there's a set in 1886 which runs from a halfpenny up to a shilling, a set of 7 stamps, which are Bermuda stamps overprinted with Gibraltar, and they're definitely worth looking out for. The lower values aren't particularly expensive, but obviously as you get more and more high value stamps up to 1 shilling, then they do command a premium. By the end of 1886, Gibraltar had actually printed their own stamps, and the first set mimicked the stamps of Bermuda, again a set of 7 from a halfpenny up to a shilling, but with Gibraltar printed on them as opposed to Bermuda. By 1889, the currency of Gibraltar had reverted to centimos and pesetas, so new sets had to be produced, and these looked very similar to the earlier stamps in shillings and pence. And curiously, these stamps can be found used in Morocco, and the only way you would know that they're used in Morocco is looking at the postmark and looking for one of the Moroccan towns, such as Tangiers or Casablanca or Tétouan. As you would expect, these command a premium. Because they're not so easy to spot, some of these do turn up occasionally, so it's definitely worth having a look for, and something you may be lucky to come across. The Edward VII and George V high value stamps are interesting because, unlike many other countries, they're double the height of the ordinary stamp. And because of changes in watermarks and in some cases in colours, there's a large selection of these that can be collected. They are quite valuable and sometimes difficult to get hold of. Some of the larger values are £300-400 in catalogue value, so it's not always going to be easy to find them, but they're quite nice looking stamps and well worth getting hold of if you can. There was a set of George V stamps produced in 1931 which showed the Rock of Gibraltar. And these are quite easy to get hold of and relatively cheap. However, there are two different types of perforation. One is perf 14 all round, and the other is 13.5 by 14. And the difference in value between these two types is quite striking. So whilst it's relatively cheap to get hold of the perf 14 stamps, the combination one, the 13.5 by 14, are catalogued at 70 odd pound mint. So once again, if you get yourself a perforation gauge, it's definitely worth checking these and to see if you've got one of the rarer ones. In 1938, there was a George VI pictorial issue printed, and I've actually done a whole YouTube video about this particular set because there are very, very many different perforation varieties. There are quite a few different colour shades, and overall they're not hugely expensive. For example, the 1 penny brown is available in 6 different varieties, and used, the most expensive one is only catalogued at £7. So it's one of those sets where you could collect a whole different varieties of stamp without having to break the bank. And as I said, I have produced a separate video solely on this set, and I will put a link to this in the comments, so it's worth having a look. In 1960, Gibraltar produced a Queen Elizabeth pictorial set, which are very colourful and quite a different style from many of the stamps that were around at the time. As a set, it's not overly expensive, so it's definitely something that you can collect. The complete set mint is only catalogued at £85 now, and they do look quite colourful and quite different from stamps that were around at the time. They show different scenes from around Gibraltar and the flora and fauna of the country, and it's something to have a look at. There are a couple of varieties there which can put the price up if you're looking for those, but as I said, the basic set is very affordable and quite a nice set to have. After that, the usual omnibus editions were printed for all Gibraltar stamps, the Freedom from Hunger, the Red Cross, Churchill Commemoration, etc. And all those are available very cheaply. In 1967, there's a nice set, and this depicts ships, which is very relevant to Gibraltar being a strategic seaport. Once again, this goes up to, from a halfpenny up to £1. It's not an expensive set to buy. The catalogue value for the whole set mint is less than £40. So it does look quite nice. It's a plain background with the different ships on the front going through the ages. And yeah, I quite like them, and I have collected many of these sets. Of the modern stamps in Gibraltar, none of them are hugely expensive, and really you can specialise or you can follow any sort of thematic you want, and there are lots of examples of these throughout the Gibraltar catalogue, and most of them are very affordable. So it is one of those countries where you can amass a large collection without spending a fortune. One to look out for, which is slightly different, is a set that was produced in 1971 when decimal currency was introduced. And these go from half a p up to £1, but for each value there were 2 separate stamps produced, one with an image from the early 19th century and the other one the same place from modern photographs. So it's quite an interesting set to look at, just for the historical value of Gibraltar and seeing how it looked early 19th century compared to how it looks now. Once again, it's not an expensive set to buy and fairly easy to get hold of. If you are going to buy them, the 2 different stamps were produced side by side, so if you can get them in pairs, that does help with the value, and I think looks better as well because you've got them side by side. A few years before this, in 1969, Gibraltar produced what was the start of a series of stamps on military uniforms. And in the end, there were 8 different series produced yearly from 1969 up to 1976. And these stamps are interesting because on the reverse of the stamp is a brief printed history of the regiment that the stamp depicts. Now this has the effect, if you buy the set mint, then the history should still be on the back of the stamp, and it's interesting, you find out a bit of information of the regiment. But if the stamp's been used, obviously once it's been stuck on an envelope, the history tends to disappear. So it's one of those sets where it's, in my opinion, it's far better to have the mint set than it is to have the used set. You can come across some that have been cancelled to order that still have the writing on the back of the stamp. But yeah, it's much better if you can to get hold of the mint ones and have a read of what's on the back. It's quite interesting. And they actually did this with a few other sets as well. There was in 1977 a flora and fauna set, and on the back there was a short description of what was in the picture. So it's an interesting idea, and one that must have been quite difficult to produce, to be honest. It would have required 2 printing processes before the stamps were gummed, I would imagine. But yeah, it's a good idea, and it's something different. After they finished the series on military uniforms, they started another series on naval crests, and these were the crests for each of the ships that were associated with Gibraltar. And there's an interesting stamp in the first series, of which I have a block of 6, and it's with an inverted watermark. Now, the original catalogue I had, Gibraltar Malta catalogue from 2013, and this is valued in that catalogue at £45 for one of the stamps, as opposed to 80p for the ordinary one. And there is no valuation for the used stamp at all, meaning they haven't found one. And as you can see, I've got a block of 6 mint and used. So I'm kind of thinking I've got something special here. And I've seen it in other catalogues valued at round about that sort of figure. So it looks like a nice thing to have. However, when I was in England recently, I bought the new catalogue of Cyprus, Gibraltar and Malta, which is the 6th edition and actually came out this year. And in that catalogue, the stamp is valued at 60p with the inverted watermark, which curiously is less than the stamp with the normal watermark. Now, I'm hoping that's actually an error. I have written to Stanley Gibbons and asked them, and they've sent an acknowledgement and passed it on to their valuation department. But as yet, I haven't had a reply from them. But it seems strange that one with an inverted watermark, the value should suddenly drop from £45–50 down to 60p. And curiously, 60p is actually the face value of the stamp. So my feeling is that Stanley Gibbons have made a mistake here. I'm waiting for a reply. But if anybody else out there has got one of these stamps or has got a different catalogue, be interested to know what the value of them are. Another set that I quite like the look of that appeared at the same time as the first series of the naval crests was in 1982 of aircraft. And presumably these would have been aircraft that had flown into Gibraltar. It goes from 1p up to £5. Not an expensive set to buy, but it's a nice set. Whether that's because I like looking at aircraft and that makes a difference. But yeah, it's one to look out for. One you can buy very, very cheaply. There doesn't appear to be any variations in amongst that set, but yeah, it's a nice set in my opinion. Around about this time, Gibraltar, like many countries, started producing mini sheets, and there are lots and lots of mini sheets that you can buy and you can collect, depicting all sorts of things. Over the years, Gibraltar has produced some nice stamps, some unusual stamps. There's quite a lot of military history involved in Gibraltar, obviously, so there are many sets showing planes or boats or military uniforms, military things, including a set on cannons in the 80s. So there's a lot, if military history is your thing, there's an awful lot that you can collect. One last one I'd like to share with you is in 2008, they produced a series of birds of the rock. Now, as a keen bird watcher, this came to my attention and I liked the look of it. And I managed to buy a special commemorative folder which contains all the stamps in the series, plus a little description. Apparently there were only 500 of these printed, so I'm hoping that the value of that will go up. However, it's such a nice series and such a nice booklet, I'm not sure I'd want to pass it on. The initial set in 2008 contained 13 stamps, going up to £5, including stamps marked S, E and U, which were for surface mail, European mail and UK mail. Subsequent years, in 2009, 2012 and 2010, they added more stamps to the set, and the final set came to 22 different stamps. They are beautifully drawn and printed, and it's a very nice set, something well worth looking at, even if you can't get hold of the commemorative folder. The set is possibly one of the more expensive sets, especially when you consider it's quite a recent edition. But even so, it's still currently catalogued around about £75, mint or used, so worth a look. Okay, well, I hope that's given you a flavour of the stamps of Gibraltar, and maybe a few of those sets have sparked your interest. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Don't forget you can visit my online stores at eBay and Delcamp under the name of Ourdadsstamps, where I have over 2,000 items for sale. Please join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Ourdadsstamps podcast.